Nate Halverson, welcome to Longer Tables.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with what is essentially the premise of the new film, The Grab. And that is that food and water are the oil of the 21st century, the most valuable and powerful resource, which of course they probably always were all along. But for the uninitiated, can you explain why this is so?
Yeah. So basically, what we've seen as we move deeper into the 21st century is that water, which we use about 70 to 80% of our fresh water to grow food, water resources are becoming scarcer in certain regions, and therefore food production is becoming harder in certain regions. And so we've seen some countries that are water short or water poor, begin to reach out, especially wealthy countries, beginning to reach out around the world. And it's really a phenomenon that's new to the 21st century as we have a much larger global population and as people's, diets begin to change and their diets require a lot more water to grow a lot more food, to feed them the things they want to eat. And so we're entering a new realm that has people in the Department of Defense, in the intelligence communities, on Wall Street, all very focused on how this is going to play out.
So, your reporting on this subject began, I believe, in 2013 when a Chinese company purchased Smithfield. Smithfield is, or was, I think, the largest pork company in the United States. It slaughters 1 in 4 American pigs, and they came in and bought it. So, let me try that again. Is it the largest?
It's the largest in the
Okay, I
world
suddenly was
in
like, I think
effect.
it's the largest.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me try that again and without saying I think it's largest. Okay. So your reporting on this subject began in 2013 when a Chinese company purchased Smithfield, which raises and slaughters 1 in 4 American pigs. How did this first appear on your radar? And also, how did it turn into a film?
Well, I'll answer the first part of that, which was that I was doing organized crime reporting in Macau.
Hmm.
And because of that, I had become familiar with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and digging through financial records. And so when China's largest meat company bought the world's largest pork company, which was Smithfield Foods based in Virginia, I was asked to look into it because the meat company was having an IPO. It was publicly traded on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And people were sort of saying, what does it mean? What's behind it? Is the Chinese government behind it? Is it just one big publicly traded company buying another big publicly traded company, as we've seen for decades? And sort of what gives. And so that was my first foray into food and water reporting. And you have a sophisticated audience, so there's people that probably have a very great depth of knowledge. But prior to that, I knew nothing more than the average person that goes out to restaurants and eats. But when I did that story, what I was able to conclusively show was that, in fact, the Chinese government was behind the takeover of Smithfield Foods, that the Chinese government has become very concerned about its ability to grow enough food to feed its population. And that around that time, they had begun putting in their 5-year plans the priority to go overseas, buy up food and water resources, to make sure that they can make their way back to the folks in China that would want that food. And this deal that effectively gave them 1 in 4 American pigs was part of that larger global scramble for food and water resources.
It's amazing that that deal went through. I mean, you would think that someone would have come in and tried to stop that. Did that happen?
So, I think we were earlier in the understanding of what's happening. At that time, mine was some of the very first reporting that was looking at this through a lens of national security. And as a matter of fact, there was legislation introduced, bipartisan legislation introduced by Senator Stabenow and Senator Grassley that cited our reporting that said, this is, we need to focus on this and we need to change basically how the government looks at these types of takeover. And that has only grown. So I think people now will be more familiar with this concern over how agriculture is being purchased in the United States and what's sort of behind it than they were 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, before we did this reporting, people really had no idea that countries were looking at this through a national security lens.
Right. And you promised to answer my second question, which was how did this turn into a film?
Right. So I continued to report on this. Basically, after I did the Smithfield food stuff, I went to our intelligence, the U.S. intelligence community, to sort of say, okay, what are you all seeing? And I began and continued my reporting. And, I ended up finding that the Saudis, the largest dairy farm in Saudi Arabia, had purchased 15 square miles of the Arizona desert. And I broke that story. And I think that story has got quite a bit of attention now. And I did a story on California literally sinking because they're over pumping the aquifers during the drought. And so I was doing these series of stories, and I was going from Venezuela to Zambia. I'd been to China, over to Europe, down to South America. I had begun to sort of piece together this larger global trend of how countries were beginning to look at food and water through a national security lens, and why people in the intelligence community and the Department of Defense were increasingly concerned. And that's when I reached, and that's sort of when we said, this is a much bigger story and we want to reach a much larger audience. And how could we do that? And we were very fortunate to be introduced to Gabriella Copperthwaite, who is the director of the film. And many people know her previous documentary, Blackfish, that looked at SeaWorld, that fundamentally changed that operation by uncovering sort of the treatment of the orcas in captivity. And we began this 4 or 5 year journey to make this film.
I want to pause and go back to one of the things that you mentioned, skipped over, I should say, because it is so shocking, which is the story of this enormous farm in Arizona that was purchased by the Saudis. Arizona is not exactly known as a place with generous water resources. So, for people who did not see that reporting, can you tell us about that and what the impacts on the ground have been?
Sure, yeah. So I first found out about that in 2015, and I went out there, and no one had reported on it. The people in the community didn't realize that a large company owned by Saudi Arabia's largest dairy operation had moved into their own backyards and was pumping up this much groundwater. They just knew that their groundwater wells were starting to go dry. And, the reason I initially looked at it, just to back up one more step, was because Saudi Arabia had essentially depleted its own aquifers in 30 years, in a simple generation, by over pumping its own groundwaters to grow wheat in the desert. And just to put it in context, in the 1990s, Saudi Arabia, a desert nation, was the world's sixth largest exporter of wheat, simply by pumping up these aquifers that were left over from like the Ice Age and using it to grow wheat in the desert, and then using that to generate profits. But it didn't last, right? Like, it doesn't last. That water went away. And I mean, so much, the water went away so much that there are wells that are mentioned, springs that are mentioned in the Bible, that then existed for the next 1,950 years, that through the process of all of this groundwater pumping have gone dry. So,
Wow.
yeah. And so what happened is as their groundwater went away, they thought, well, we need to go elsewhere to find groundwater. And they had an expertise and a background in doing this in the desert. And there are these aquifers that exist under the Arizona desert. And I'm talking like saguaro cactuses, Wile E. coyote, like, what you think of
Right.
when you think of Arizona desert. And they went up there and they started pumping up the water and using it to grow hay. And what had been, this just sort of pristine desert land had evolved into farmland, and they would grow hay that they would then bundle up and compress into these tight little hay bales and send it to Long Beach, California, and then ship it around the world to Riyadh, because that's how you move water from one place in the world to another place in the world. Like, you couldn't fill up enough oil tankers with water to be meaningful. Instead, what you do is you take the water that exists in one place and you use it to grow food, which again, we use water, like goes like 70-80% of it goes to growing food. You grow the food where the water is, and then you ship the food. And economists will say that's shipping virtual water. So that's how you move water around the world. And that's what they were doing. And the impact in Arizona was that these local communities, many people who were retirees from California and elsewhere and had put their life savings into their homes, were seeing their wells go dry. And as that happens, the value of their home without water is, darn near worthless. You can't live there without water, can't shower, right? And so people were seeing what they had worked hard for their entire lives literally being sucked out from underneath them. And that continues today.
To be clear, they weren't doing this in Arizona just because they were familiar with pumping groundwater from the desert. It was because there are no regulations to prevent them from doing it. You can just pump as much groundwater as you want or need in Arizona.
That's right. It's still today, what are we, 9 years after I first broke that story? These regions allow unlimited pumping of groundwater. So if you buy the piece of land, you can drill a well and you can suck up as much water as you want, no matter the impact on the people around you.
It's amazing. I mean, I'm sitting here shaking my head. I'm sure listeners will be shaking their heads. And it does seem mad that the American government does not understand how essential it is to protect these resources. And I think you've mentioned in your, sorry, I'll say that again, but your reporting has shown that other governments do understand. So why does China get this? Why do the Arab states get this and we don't?
Yeah, it's an interesting backstory, and it's historical. First off, you have to put it in context that the leaders of China remember the Great Famine. Xi Jinping recalls being a youth during the Great Famine and having periods where there was no food, and so they're much more attuned to it. And they also, I think, are better. I think largely recognized better at long-term forecasting than maybe perhaps the U.S. government, and acting on it. And so they began seeing the demographics changing. And to contextualize this a little bit, you have to remember that one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century was accomplished by China. And that was pulling 400 million people out of extreme poverty in 2 or 3 decades. I mean, it's an absolutely incredible feat that no other government has achieved. 400 million people out of extreme poverty in 20 or 30 years. The issue that they then faced was, as they created the world's largest middle class, was that people wanted to eat diets closer to how the West eat. And that means more
Mm-hmm.
meat per capita. And meat requires a lot of grain, a lot of feed, which requires a lot of water. And so what we're seeing from these countries is really they're going out as their diets change, that diet requires a lot more water. And China was running the modeling and looking at the numbers and saying, we have an increasingly wealthy population. It's not even so much that their population was growing so much in size as it was growing wealthier and eating more meat. And so they began looking at those numbers, and that was the trend line that they were seeing, and they reacted to. And it's why, you see things like their 5-year plans include, as a national priority, going over and securing food and water resources.
Now it's time for our special Good Neighbor segment, brought to you by our sponsor, State Farm. As my listeners know, I value the importance of forming connections and being there for others. Or, as a State Farm would say, being a good neighbor. Some of the good neighbors in my community are my local farmers markets vendors. I make it a point to know them because they bring the freshest, most beautiful food, which right now means snap peas, baby lettuces, and strawberries. And the farmers know me because I am the guy who gets really excited at the market. I will often buy flats of whatever I've been missing since the season last year. Strawberries, I'm talking to you. Okay, yeah, I hear about this overbuying later from my wife. I get it. But how can anyone resist in that moment? The food is gorgeous, and it's my way to support farmers and my community. And this is how I show up as a good neighbor to them too. So thanks to State Farm for sponsoring longer tables and reminding us of the importance of being there for those around you. State Farm is there with the coverage you need for your car, your home, and even boats, motorcycles, RVs, and other things that matter to you. With a State Farm agent, you know someone is there to help you choose the coverage you need. With so many coverage options, it feels good knowing you can find what works best for you and your needs. And when you need ways to get help, State Farm gives you options there too. Whatever it is, in person or on the phone with your local agent or on statefarm.com or on their award-winning app, State Farm lets you do things your way. So when you need help protecting the things that matter most, remember to say, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
You talk about being good at planning, but I think having a memory of famine or having a memory of being hungry, really stays with a people and a culture. I mean, I think it's something Americans sort of can't understand. I mean, this country is built on abundance. It's built on amber waves of grain, right? And I think that it's just hard for people to believe that it could ever be a problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. I think, my grandparents' generation lived through the Great Depression and through the Dust Bowl. And I think with that generation, there was a deeper understanding that scarcity can come fast and, can come fast and severely. Um, and I don't know that my generation, younger generations, it's like we don't live under the shadow of a really terrible experience. And so I think having gone through that as a nation, China is much more attuned to it.
Yeah. A big focus in the film is something that you call the Trove. So tell us what the Trove is and what you discovered.
Yeah, basically, we were able to get our hands on a bunch of emails from a fairly well known private military corporation, often referred to as mercenary, um, who was working with, and I don't want to tell folks that are going to go out and see the film too much, but we're working with a very powerful government in the Middle East to go overseas and buy up food and water resources on behalf of a government. And so what you see is you have mercenary groups that are going into low income countries in search of food and water. And I think what's astounding there, it's like, we know that this happens with oil, right? We know that this happens with diamonds. We know that this happens with gold. But the trend line that we're seeing now is that this is what's going on with food and water. This is how elevated and focused very wealthy countries are now on securing those resources for the future.
Okay. I'm tempted to go down the question with invisibility cloaks, but I'm going to. I can't decide if I should go there. I think I will go there briefly. So
Yeah.
when what you've just described, people are picturing, soldiers with machine guns around a field of crops, but you're also talking about crazy military technology to protect these valuable resources. Things
Yeah.
like invisibility cloaks. You got to tell us about the invisibility cloaks.
Well, this was a thing. I mean, again, it's like you start off looking at food and water issues, and you just following the story, and it's leading me to mercenaries, and it's leading me to companies that are developing things like invisibility cloaks and jetpacks and technologies that can be used in developing countries on the front lines of resource exploration, whether that's an oil refinery or whether that's a large farm where people have been displaced and have lost access to their ancestral land and water and food sources and are now angry and are now growing increasingly restless and are organizing and are going to push back. Right. And so you're seeing these technologies being developed and being marketed to be deployed in this way. And again, yeah, I'm going to interrupt myself. I just got to trying to reconnect. So I
Yeah,
think,
I didn't hear anything about the end of that.
okay. Well, I certainly do. Yeah. Um,
You're like 100.
yeah. Let me shut down Firefox.
Also, Chris, do you not want me to ask about military invisibility cloaks? Is that okay? I don't know. Trying to stay on track here. It, yeah, it's terrifying. I had to start it and then stop and then sort of gear up to watch it because I was like, this is miserable. This is like, we're fucked. Could the name of the documentary could have been like, we're fucked.
Yeah. Um, I think my signal's better now. So hopefully
Okay.
this is good because you're less pixelated. Um,
So should I ask my question about invisibility cloaks again? And we'll
yeah.
try that again.
Yeah, that's great.
Because I did not hear anything you said.
Okay, great. Let's do it again.
Okay. I mean, maybe it was perfect. I don't know. Okay. So what you're describing to listeners is men with machine guns slung over their backs, basically protecting a field of crops, which is crazy in and of itself. But by following the money and following the emails, you also turned up some other crazy military technology that's being used in what you describe as this grab for water resources. Tell us about those.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, like I said, I started off just looking at food and water issues, and then that took me into the path of national security, intelligence communities, mercenaries, and then finding these corporations that were developing technologies like invisibility cloaks, like jetpacks, that could be used on sort of the front lines of exploration for resources, oil refineries, but also large farms. Because the thing about when you go into a country, a developing country, and want to buy a big piece of land for farm, it's going to be larger in size than a mining operation. It's going to be larger in size than what an oil refinery would need. You need a lot of land for farms. And so you end up with the potential of displacing a lot more people. And, like you look at Africa and where they say, 40% of the world's arable land is there being, unused. Well, it's being used. It's being used by the people who live there, and they're doing
Right.
subsistence farming. It's their ancestral land. And so what you see with a lot of these large agricultural deals is that people get moved off their land. They lose access to being able to feed themselves. They lose access to their water, right? And so they get understandably pissed, right? And they begin organizing. And in that organizing, they begin pushing back, right? And in that pushback, sometimes they can be labeled terrorists, right? Or they can be labeled insurrectionists, right? And then you deploy force against them, where they have these historic grievances. And these technologies that are being marketed are things like, can be like jetpacks to get out of a tough spot if your camp is overrun, right? And so you begin seeing that stuff, and you begin understanding why intelligence communities are increasingly worried that food and water competition is going to be driving these, these internal conflicts that can blow up into full-on civil wars.
Right. One of the things that I really liked about the film was that it showed the incredibly painstaking nature of investigative reporting. I have a short attention span, so I cannot imagine doing that. And I want to ask you a little bit about that and about you and your personality. I mean, what makes it possible for you to do this? I mean, were you, I don't know, the kid who could,
Dropped as a
sit
child.
for hours and do Legos, or I don't know. I mean, is it the thrill of the chase? What is it that motivates you and allows you to stick with a story?
I mean, it is part uncovering truths and information that exists in the shadows, right? And then putting that together and sharing it with people. Like, I fundamentally view my role as a journalist. This is a little bit, I'll answer this from a professional standpoint, then I'll answer it from a personal standpoint. From the professional standpoint, I view my role as a journalist as not like to advocate for any one thing, but really to go out and collect hard to find information and to gather it up and to put it down impartially in front of the public so that people can see it, can make decisions and have discussions and debates, based on good information. And so like and I enjoy it. Like, I enjoy going out. I enjoy the collection process from a personal reason, from like a personal space. I will tell you one of my hobbies that might also further like elucidate why I find this pleasurable. And that's mushroom foraging. Like, I love mushroom foraging. I love, yeah, I love going into the forest, and you don't know on any given day if you're going to find anything, right? But you just push through and you look and you search and you keep your eyes down, or you looking on the side of a dead tree and you're scoping, and you can go on for hours, and you don't know, but every now and then, boom, there's a flush of morels, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden you just like, you're so excited, and you're so happy, and you're scooping them up and you're putting them, and you're going to cook them that night. And it's that same feeling of that sort of gatherer hunter kind of like mentality that I think drives me when I'm in search of information, because oftentimes I'll go looking for something not knowing if it's there or not. I have no idea. And there's way more dead ends. There's way more meadows in the forest not full of mushrooms than there are the occasional pocket of mushrooms that are popping up that are mushrooms you want to eat.
This episode of Longer Tables is supported by the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder. From muddy jungle paths and snowy trails to rolling sand dunes, the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder has the capability to take you to some of the most epic destinations on Earth. As you know, I love to travel. That's why I'm so excited to this partnership with Nissan. There is no better vehicle for chasing bigger, better, and more exciting adventures than the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder. With 7 drive modes, the Pathfinder's available intelligent 4-wheel drive is built for even the most epic journeys. And it even has up to 6,000 pounds of towing capacity, so you can bring the fun with you. So, thanks again to Nissan for supporting Longer Tables and for the reminder to chase bigger, better, more exciting adventures and enjoy the ride along the way. Learn more at nissanusa.com. Intelligent 4-wheel drive cannot prevent collisions or provide enhanced traction in all conditions. Always monitor traffic and weather conditions. Towing capacity varies by configuration. See Nissan Towing Guide and Owner's Manual for additional information.
I want to switch gears a little and talk about Ukraine. Um, Listeners to this show know that José Andrés has been very involved in feeding people there. It's something that we are all watching from here with great sadness for more than 2 years. the conventional, or at least a big part of the conventional explanation for why Putin invaded Ukraine is his determination to recreate the old style Russian Empire. But you argue that water has a lot to do with it. So explain that.
Yeah, I think, first off, I'll say I don't have any specific understanding of Putin's motivation. I'm not in his head. I don't even know if our intelligence community has that direct of a line onto what the exact motivation was. What I can say is that, like everyone else, I was watching a lot of the coverage at the beginning that was talking about Putin's desire for rebuilding, the glories of the Soviet Union as almost like this romanticized vision he was looking to achieve. And that without the context of what's unique about Ukraine. And what's unique about Ukraine is it has the second richest soil anywhere in the world, second only to Iowa in terms of the depth and richness of that soil. It's incredible. Ukraine has always been considered the breadbasket of Europe. And prior to the invasion, Russia had been talking about creating a grain OPEC, right? Like essentially doing what had been done for the petroleum producing countries, but for the grain producing countries. And with Russia and Ukraine combined, you're now talking about truly a food superpower, becoming the largest exporter of multiple crops of grains. And as we've seen, as we move further into the 21st century, food is power. Food is power. And to be able to control that much food, especially given that more countries are beholden to importing food from countries like Ukraine and Russia, it gives them a lot of geopolitical strength. And that's what we were told when we went to Russia and we interviewed like the head of the meat company in Russia. He said this came straight from Putin. This idea of increasing Russia's food strength. Food is power.
I'm always hesitant to ask what individuals can do to fix a problem because especially with something like this, there are so many issues that are systemic. The individual cannot solve it. I have a soapbox that I get on all the time about how we individuals are asked to fix these problems without any help from government. But listening to you talk, and you alluded to this, that one thing that does jump to my mind is meat consumption. I mean, the hay grown in Arizona, shipped around the world to Saudi Arabia was to feed cattle. I mean, it wasn't even like they were shipping food for people. And a lot of farmland is used to grow feed for cattle. Now, I know it's a really charged issue because it's easy for us to say, well, you shouldn't eat as much meat as we eat. But does reducing meat as an individual or as a society or as a planet, would that go some way to reducing the strain that countries clearly feel like they're under?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. And the short answer is yes. And I have the classified cable that came from the State Department on their tour to meet with Nestle, the world's largest meat company. Now, okay, full disclosure, I'm not a vegetarian and I'm not a vegan. And I'll tell you kind of at the end of this, how I've personally approached it, if that's useful for other people. I hit my mic. If that's useful for other people. But, let me see, where was I going to go there?
Well, I want to hear about the Nestle cable.
Yeah. So, in 2009, the U.S. Embassy in Switzerland went to go visit Nestle's headquarters, and they got a tour from the chief economist of Nestle. And so if you remember, 2009 is at like the height of the Great Recession. The world markets are literally frozen, housing prices everywhere are crumbling, unemployment skyrocketing. We weren't sure if we were going to get out of it. And the chief economist at Nestle said, stop freaking out about that. It's a blip. It's going to go off. It's going to resolve. What you need to be really focused and worried about is that the world is running out of enough fresh water to feed everybody. And this is what he said. He said that if the rest of the world were to eat as much meat per capita as Americans do, the world would have run out of fresh water in the year 2000.
Wow.
And that's from Nestle, the world's largest food company that produces a lot of meat products, right? And they also have some of the best, if not the best, water modeling. So they have, they just from an economic, from a business standpoint, they need to know what the situation is with water, and this is what they're seeing, and this is what they're saying. Now, from a practical level, then for people like me who I'm not a vegetarian and I'm not a vegan. And for the people that are, they can definitely look down on us meat eaters and say they're doing a better job of preventing this. They are. It's just what it is. What I've done personally through my now 10 years of reporting on this, I've just reduced my meat consumption. And I've looked at it more in a historical context, right? Like we have these sayings, like, oh, me and my buddy, we chewed the fat, right? Like, why would you chew the fat? And you would chew the fat because you'd walk like a mile to the nearest house, which was a farm away, right? And because you walked all the way there, your buddy would have a ham hock or something hanging from the rafters, and he would cut off a piece of fat and cut it in half, and you both would sit there. Eating meat was ceremonial. It was celebration. It wasn't 3 meals a day, right? It was something that you did when you wanted to celebrate or convene or be together. There are these expressions, like my man brings home the bacon, right? Like we have these expressions that speak to the idea that we didn't eat meat every single meal. And I think also just like, I'm not a nutritionist. I don't focus on nutrition in my reporting, but I think from what I've read, just as an average Joe, what we see too is this overconsumption of meat has deleterious health impacts on people. So I think moving us closer to maybe how much meat we were eating 100 years ago, how much our great grandparents were eating meat probably moves the world into a more sustainable place, moves our bodies into a more sustainable place.
Yeah. What so that's for individuals, and I'm sure there are other things that individuals could do to tweak around the edges, but what response have you seen to your reporting? Has there been, has the penny dropped? Have you seen any changes that you think are good changes? Let me ask that again. Have you seen the US government making any changes in policy or at least in attitude?
I will say one of the coolest changes I've seen is that water has been very political. And, I think the old sort of rule of thumb would have been that Democrats were environmentalists that wanted to clamp down and shut things down, and Republicans were very free market and hands off and let the farmers do what the farmers need to do. And I understand both because A, we need to protect the environment, but B, if you impact a farmer's ability to grow food and you throw off the food system, you can end up with a great famine like China did, right? You have to be very careful on how we manage our agrarian society. And it's really tough to be a farmer. But one of the cool things I've seen is that, like in Arizona, the county supervisor, who's a very staunch Republican, in the area where these big mega farms have come in and are pumping up the water with no regulations, she is now a very strong advocate for regulating the water to make sure that her community, again, who are largely Republicans in this part of the state, are going to be protected and are going to have water supplies, right? And she's doing it through the framework of a Republican, but she's working with Democrats. And in America, I think we all know that these political divides have just been very frustrating for us in the general public because we feel like things aren't getting done. And so to see Holly Irwin, the county supervisor, who's a Republican, working with the Democratic Attorney General and others to really push forward and create what I think a lot of people feel are sensible solutions in a bipartisan manner, that to me has been cool to see. Just people getting stuff done via, despite whatever side of the political aisle you come from.
What are you still most worried about? What should we worry about? That's probably not a good way to end, but I can't help asking.
Yeah. Well, okay. First, I'll say that if you just sit around and worry, you're going to drain all of your emotional strength and you're going to get nothing done. Right. And so I hope everybody's finding time to be with family and friends and laugh and eat and find the joy that is always in life, because I have been into some deeply impacted communities where they have dealt with some severe trauma and continued trauma. And I will tell you, people still laugh. people still make jokes, they still love, and it's a great lesson for those of us who aren't necessarily dealing directly with some of those issues, but are dealing with watching it, is to remember to laugh and love and find joy in things. I am not an expert per se. What I do is I go and I find experts. I find experts who've worked in the intelligence community or Defense Department or Wall Street, and I ask them what they're worried about. And people are pretty worried. People are pretty worried that if we don't move forward with the solutions, that things, that we will see parts of the world that are already fragile, that begin to fracture into civil wars, and civil wars that can expand into international wars and mass migration, the likes of probably which we haven't seen before as a species, as agriculture and food and water become increasingly scarce in some regions. And I will again circle back to say that that's not a given. That's just the given if we don't do anything. Like, that's the trajectory that we're on. If we as a national society and as an international society, of humans, don't choose to put forward some ideas on how to solve these problems, so which we're certainly capable of. Like, we all have agency. Our countries, our governments have agencies. Our international bodies have agencies. So, like, these things aren't given. They can be avoided. We can move forward. The current track isn't particularly great.
Nate Halverson, what everyone can do. I tried to send you a softball there, is watch the film The Grab.
Oh,
right?
Shoot. I should have plugged the film. I'm so bad at this.
I'm kidding. No, but that was an excellent answer. And I think remembering to laugh and remembering that we have agency are so, so important. So I thank you very much for the film and for all of your amazing work. And thank you for being on Longer Tables.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.